ever and joyful song. Morning, good to see you out this morning. It has been said that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should probably listen twice as much as we talk. That's probably not a bad idea. We want to study together this morning something along those lines. In James chapter 1 and verse number 19, we're taught that we are to be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath or anger. Beginning in verse 16 of James chapter 1, he says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of his creatures. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Our tongue certainly gets us into trouble a lot more than almost any other part of our body. In fact, of the 7 things in Proverbs chapter 6 and verses 16 through 19, that it says there are 6 things that God hates, yes, 7 that are an abomination to him. Of those 7 things, 3 of the 7, nearly half of them, involve the tongue, the mouth, getting people into trouble. A lying tongue, a false witness, and one who sows discord among his brothers. All 3 of those have to do with the tongue. James says in James chapter 3 and verses 2 through 9, just exactly how bad our tongues really are. He says, "For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body." He says, if you can stop your tongue from saying the wrong things, then the rest of it will be easy for you. If you can bridle that, then you can bridle the whole body. He says, "Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships, although they are so large and driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue." That's why we have to keep it caged up, because we can't tame it. We can't trust it. You know, there are all kinds of animals, big animals even, that can be quite tame, and you can trust them around a child, but not the tongue. It is an unruly evil, he says, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. And he says that shouldn't be that way. What do we use our tongues for? How much do we use them when we ought to keep them quiet? Sometimes we need to bite our tongue. Sometimes we need to open our ears. I think the ladies would probably all agree that men are not particularly good at listening. And since they're not listening, you ladies can agree with that, because they didn't hear that, right? Because they weren't listening. We seem to sometimes have selective hearing. We hear what we want to hear. You know, When the call is supper's ready, we hear that. But when it's the garbage needs to be taken out, huh? What? Didn't hear that one. Didn't hear that. The lawn needs mowed for 3 days before that one sinks in. There are a lot of those things where we choose. And to be fair, I think sometimes there are some ladies that may be a little hard of hearing when something's being said they don't want to hear too. Teenagers are really good at not listening when somebody's trying to explain the ways of the world to them, because they already know it all, of course, so they don't need to listen. But it is something that we are all, as human beings, pretty bad about. We listen to what we want to listen to. How many times have you had a conversation with somebody where you started to say something, and whatever you were starting to tell them about got them remembering or thinking about something, and so they blurted in, or maybe you were on the other side, somebody tried to tell you about something and it reminded you, and say, oh, well, let me tell you about this, and cut them off and don't listen to what they originally were going to tell you. I'm sure that never happens, and I'm sure none of us would ever not listen and cut somebody off like that, right? I think we all do at times. It's important for us to listen. We have this problem at work quite often. Somebody will come in and they want something, and so they come to someone for help because they're trying to find a particular item at the store. And so what do they need? What do? They start explaining what they need. Well, so many times one of us workers will hear a certain word and we'll think, oh, I know what they need, and we'll take them to it. Because of that, I've had people come to the electric department because they were looking for bulbs, which is not unusual. That's in the electrical department. Unfortunately, they were looking for tulip bulbs. We don't keep those in electrical. That's in lawn and garden. And so sometimes people will hear a word, and they hear a thing, and they think it's one thing when it's really something else. Sometimes people will bring someone to me, they're looking for wire. And I start showing them a wire. Well, what kind of wire are you looking for? Well, I'm looking for picture hanging wire. Well, that's not over here in electrical. That's over there in the fasteners department. And sometimes we just jump at something when we hear something. And we don't listen to what's really being said. If we'll listen, we'll find out what's really going on most of the time. So we need to be swift to hear. Jesus often said, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear. We've got ears to hear. We need to hear. We need to listen. We need to be sure that we're not dull of hearing, like those in Hebrews 5 and verse 11. He says, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. That usually happens after about 5 minutes of the sermon. You start to get dull of hearing, right? You've heard enough, and then you start to want to doze. Or it happens to us all. We can only listen for so long. Of course, someone once said that the attention span, the ability of someone to listen, is limited by their ability to sit comfortably. After we sit for a while, I got to get up and move around. I've been sitting here too long. My leg's falling asleep. I got to move. And so sometimes we can't listen because we're tired of sitting. So maybe in the middle of my sermon, we'll make everybody stand up and I stretch a little, and then I could preach twice as long that way, right? That'd be good. The thing we have to realize is listening is important, because listening is how we learn. Have you ever learned something when you were talking? No, because when we're talking, we're saying things we already know. When someone else is talking, we have the opportunity to learn something that they know that we might not. And so sometimes we learn when we listen, not so much when we're talking. Listening brings wisdom. Several places in Proverbs talk about this. Proverbs 1 and verse 5 tells us that a wise man will hear and increase learning. and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. So if we listen, we're going to increase our learning. Now, some of the things we learn may be things we didn't want to know. I mean, I've listened to some things that I wish I didn't learn. That's happened sometimes. But the way to learn is to listen. And if we're understanding, we're going to find wise counsel to listen to, someone who knows more than we do. In Proverbs 8 and verse 33, he says, "Hear instruction and be wise. Do not disdain it." In chapter 15 and verse 31 and 32, he says, "The ear that hears the rebukes of life will abide among the wise." How many people don't listen to the warnings, and it costs them dearly? Sometimes it may cost them time. Sometimes it may cost them money. Sometimes it may cost them an eye or an arm or a leg or their life, because they didn't listen to the rebukes of life. They didn't heed the warnings. They didn't get to abide among the wise. There's an entire series of books that's called the Darwin Awards. And it comes from the idea that Charles Darwin had of the survival of the fittest one. The idea of all of the stories in the book are people who did really dumb things and died doing those really dumb things, so that their genes then didn't get passed on to the next generation, is the idea behind it. But if they had heeded some warnings, it might have saved their life, and the lives of many would have been better. They wouldn't have been mourning the loss of a loved one. He says, "He who disdains instruction hates his own soul, but the one who heeds rebuke gets understanding." And then in Proverbs 19 and verse 20, he says, "Listen to counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter days." We need to understand how important it is to listen. We need to be quick to listen, because it is the thing that's helpful to us. I can remember on one occasion we were in a Bible study at church, and a mother and daughter were arguing furiously. The daughter was 17, 18 years old, and the mother, of course, they're arguing furiously back and forth about something. And as I sat and listened to them, I realized that they were both saying the same thing, just in different ways. And they were both arguing their point so aggressively they weren't listening to the fact that the other person was saying the same exact thing, just in different words, different way of saying it. And I had to finally call them, I said, hold on just a minute. I said, hey, if we listen to each other, y'all are both saying the same thing. You both agree. You're just wording it differently, and that's throwing you off. Because sometimes we expect something to be said a certain way, and we miss it if it's not said the way we expect it to be said. But we've got to be swift to hear. We've got to listen and learn and not be dull of hearing. And then we've got to be slow to speak. Quickly speaking brings shame. It's a dangerous thing when we blurt out the answer too soon. You've seen that on those game shows where they maybe start to ask a question and somebody buzzes in and they give the answer and, oh, I'm sorry, you didn't listen to the whole question. You answered the wrong thing because you jumped in too quick. It happens quite often on those game shows, which is embarrassing, I guess, a little, and they maybe lose out on some prize money they could have won. It's not life-threatening in those situations, but sometimes it can be even more dangerous. In Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 13, it says, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him." We need to not jump to conclusions. We need not assume that we know until we've heard the matter. So we don't answer before we know. Proverbs 29 and verse 20 says, do you see a man who's hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. It says if you talk too fast, talk too quick, jump in and answer the question before it's asked. He said, that's not good. It'd be better off to be a fool than that. We need to think before we speak. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, Proverbs 15:28 tells us. But the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. It says if you're righteous, you're going to think about your answer. You're not just going to blurt out the first thing that comes into your mind. Taste those words and see if they're sweet before you put them out there into the world. Be sure the time is right. Sometimes we may have an accurate thing to say, but it might not be the best time to say it. Proverbs 15 and verse 23. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season. How good it is when you say the right thing at the right time. But sometimes we say things at the wrong time, and it causes more hurt and pain than it does help. Even if our intentions may be good, we have to think about what we say before we say it and make sure it's the right time to say it. And some things it may just be the circumstance. I mean, think about this yourself. Let's say you were doing something that was wrong. Would you prefer for someone to stand in front of the whole congregation and call you out by name and point at you and say, hey, you've been doing this and it's wrong? Or would you prefer for them to take you aside privately and say, hey, I've noticed you've been doing this and that's the wrong thing to do. You might want to do it this other way instead. This is the way the Bible tells us we should do this. Which one of those is good? It's the same thing. You're still being told the same thing, but having it done publicly and embarrassing you is not the best way many times for that to take place. It's better to do it privately. I remember someone said, praise publicly, but correct privately. And now they were talking about that with a parenting technique, that if you have something good to say about your children, say that where other people can hear you saying good things to them about what they've done good. But if they're doing something wrong, take them aside privately and make those corrections so that you don't crush their spirit in the process. When you do speak softly and calmly instead of yelling and screaming at somebody. I can't think of a time where I ever felt better after somebody yelled at me, or where I ever wanted to do what the person who yelled at me wanted to do. I might have done it out of embarrassment, or might have been cowed into it when it was, if it was an authority figure when I was younger or whatever, but most of us don't like to be yelled at. I guess there are a few people that may enjoy that, but I haven't met very many of them. Notice what Proverbs 15:1 says. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. That's why we're told to speak the truth in love. Not in anger, but in love. Not harshly. Yes, it's true that the truth is a hard thing. The truth is unyielding and it is harsh. But we can say it in a loving way to soften the blow. Or we can say it in such a way that someone is crushed by it and becomes angry with us. or turns against the truth as a result of it. Now, obviously, no matter how perfectly you speak, there are still going to be people who are going to be offended, people who are going to be turned off. Jesus was perfect in every way, and yet there were still people that hated him enough that they killed him for it. So you're never going to be able to say the perfect thing in the perfect way for everybody every time. But that doesn't mean we don't try. We still make an effort. And a lack of control of our speech makes our religion useless. In James 1 and verse 26, he says, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. If you can't keep control of your tongue, and how many times have you seen that? You've seen people who seem to be religious. They go to church and then they open their mouth, and the horrible things that come out of that mouth make you think, well, that person's not a religious person at all, after all. That person's not a Christian person. That's, I think, part of what Peter tried to do. Remember when Peter was there at the night Jesus was betrayed and arrested, and he's sitting there, and they say, hey, weren't you with him? And he says, no. And they say, I'm pretty sure I saw you out there with him. And he says, oh, no. And then the third time when they confront him with it, they say, yeah, I'm pretty sure you were out there with him. You're one of his disciples. He began to curse and to swear, and his language was to try to let them know, I'm not anything like that fellow. I don't belong. I don't know him. I don't have anything to do with him. Because our words, the way that we speak, the things that we say, and the way that we say them, lets people know pretty quickly whether we're following Christ or not. In addition to being swift to hear and slow to speak, James also tells us that we are to be slow to wrath, slow to anger. We need to remember that wrath and vengeance belong to God. It is his place to have anger toward others. He is perfect. He is sinless. All of us have sinned. And so when we get angry at somebody else for sinning, we're kind of a little bit of hypocrite because we don't get our anger at ourselves for sinning. Well, maybe we do. But we need to beware of wrath and anger. Romans 12, 17 through 21 warns us about repaying evil for evil. Talks to us about living peaceably with all men and not avenging ourselves, but giving place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. We talked about that a few weeks ago, overcoming evil with good things. Wrath is not the way to do it. Anger is not the way to do it. You can't, through anger, force somebody to come to love Christ. No matter how angry you get, it's not going to help them love Christ and love God. It doesn't work that way. Anger, and that's what James says, the wrath of man, anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God. There is no way to get from point A to point B. If you have the wrath, you cannot get to righteousness that way. It's not possible. It does not produce that fruit. It never can. Outbursts of wrath or anger are not fitting for Christians. And I know all of us at times struggle to contain our temper. We all struggle with getting angry. But those outbursts are dangerous. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 20, Paul writes to Corinthians, he says, I fear lest when I come I shall not find you as I wish, and that I shall be found by you such as you do not wish, lest there be contentions and jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, backbitings, whisperings, conceits, and tumults. He said these are things that he doesn't want to see in the church. These are things that don't belong there. In Galatians 5 and verses 19 through 21, the works of the flesh are listed. And outbursts of wrath is listed as one of those in verse 20. Hatred and contentions and outbursts of wrath. All of these things stemming from anger. In Ephesians 4, verses 31 and 32 also. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Well, that's a lot of bad things wrapped up together there in one verse. But look at those things. Look how these all spew out from the heart. Anger and wrath. And then evil speaking springs out there too. When we're angry, when we're filled with wrath, we're much more likely to say something that later, with a calm mind, we're going to regret. Just like we're much more likely to do something we're going to regret. Anger is a powerful emotion. It's probably why, of all of the things that we remember in our lives, times when we got really angry, we remember those. We remember those things for years because of that strong emotion that's tied to it. The problem with anger is they've done some studies, and I don't know exactly how they tested all these things, but they came to the conclusion that the way that people act when they're angry, the things that they say and do when they're angry, is very much like the way a person acts when they're drunk. They lose their inhibitions. They lose control of the things that normally they would say to themselves, I shouldn't do this thing. And they just get so angry that they lash out with words or with deeds. Because we've even heard the phrase, perhaps, someone did it in a drunken rage. Well, now that may have been that they were drunk and angry, but it may just be that they were so angry that they were like they were drunk. We talk about people being drunk with anger, just filled with anger. And it's a dangerous thing for sure. He says instead, we are to be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another just as God in Christ forgave you. We need to beware. It's easy to lose our temper. But the easy things are not usually the best things. It's tough to keep our temper under control. But it's better. It's better for us and it's better for those around us. Saw a story, I think it was in Denver. A 13-year-old boy, 13. And there was I think he was about a 60-year-old man was on the bus, and the 60-year-old man's foot was out in the walkway blocking it. And the young man got so angry at his foot being out in the aisle, blocking the aisle, that he shot and killed the man. Now, he not only took somebody else's life, but he ruined his by that outburst of anger over what? Because somebody's foot was in the way? You couldn't step over it? And you're 13. You could just step over that foot. It's not that big a deal. But that outburst of anger is going to haunt him for the rest of his life, because now he's murdered someone in anger. Colossians 3 and verses 6 through 10 says, though, that because of these things the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience. God's wrath is righteous wrath, because he knows everything about the situation. He knows what is right and what is wrong. And so for him to be angry He understands and knows. It's not a problem. But for us, we don't know the whole story many times. He says, but now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. And he goes on. Being slow to anger is a wise thing. Proverbs 14:17 says, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly. You lose your temper and you do something dumb. It happens all the time. Proverbs 14:29, he who is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he who is impulsive exalts folly. Proverbs 15:18 says, a wrathful man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger allays contention. He eases things by being slow to anger. Ecclesiastes 7:9 says, do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. And it's also dangerous for us to keep anger within. Don't keep that anger inside. In Ephesians 4 verses 26 and 27 says, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. If you keep that anger stored up inside, it turns to bitterness. It'll destroy you from the inside out. Ecclesiastes 7:9 says that anger rests in the bosom of fools. We don't want to be fools. We don't want to let anger rest there. Oh yes, there are certainly things that are going to make us angry. But we cannot allow that anger to rest within us. We can't allow the anger to make a home in our hearts. It's not always easy to listen with deep understanding, especially if what you're hearing isn't pleasant to you. It's hard to listen sometimes. It's not easy to refrain from speaking when you have a strong desire to say something and get it out there. And it's not easy to control feelings of anger that might cause us to lash out at others. You know, it's not easy to make our religion real and apply it to our daily life. But that's what God calls us to do. He doesn't call on us to just call ourselves Christians and show up at church. He calls on us to live each and every day and to work on our hearts and our behaviors to live our lives day in and day out the way He wants us to live. To be better people. To be His children. Just as parents try to train their children, God is trying to train us. Train us to be better. Train us to be right. If anyone thinks he is religious and doesn't bridle his tongue, his religion is useless. 1 Peter 3:8-12. We'll close with this thought. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion to one another. Love as brothers. Be tender-hearted. Be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. For he who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. You don't want the face of the Lord against you. Don't do what is evil. Do what is good. Do what is kind and loving. Be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. If you're here and you have a need to respond to God's invitation, maybe you've struggled with these things and you need the prayers of the church. Maybe you just haven't started following God as you should. You've been living your own life your own way. Maybe you need to turn your life over to Him and let Him guide you in the direction that you should go. If you're not a Christian, you can become one. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, if you're willing to repent of your sins and confess Him as the Son of God, if you're willing to be baptized to wash your sins away, He can bring you back up from that watery grave as a new person, ready to have a new heart to do the things that He wants you to do. If you're here and you have a need to respond for any reason, please do so as we stand and as we sing.
Rescue the perishing,
Care for the dying.